Okay, chapter 5 is about inverse function. An inverse function is a function that undoes f of x. And we notate it by f to the negative 1 of x. But it's not an exponent. It's when we see that negative 1, we say f inverse of x. So find the inverse of a function and restrict the domain if necessary. So I'm going to show you a couple ways, and then you can choose the way that is easiest for you. So the first thing I'm going to do for number 1, f of x, is I'm going to write down what's happening. So if f of x is 2x minus 5, if I was to plug something in for x, the first thing I would do would be multiply by 2, and then I would subtract 7, right? That's what that how about 5, not 7? That's what that equation is telling us to do. Well, if I'm going to undo that, I'm going to do reverse order and opposite of whatever math was happening. So from the bottom up, instead of subtract 5, I'm going to add 5. Instead of multiply by 2, I'm going to divide by 2. Do the opposite thing. So I put an X on the paper, and then I need to do this list in the order it's written. I already wrote it backwards, right? So I'm going to add, with the pencil, add 5, and then I'm going to divide that answer by 2, and I'm going to call this our fancy notation, f inverse of x. This is the inverse function. Got a little crammed in there. Another way to do it is to take your original equation, so I'm still doing number 1. Take your original equation and switch x and y. We all know f of x is a fancy way to say y. So this really says y equals 2x minus 5. So if you switch the x and y, x equals 2y minus 5, and then you start solving it for y. So I would add 5 to both sides, and then I would divide by 2 to get y alone. Now that I have y alone, I'm going to use my fancy inverse notation, x plus 5 over 2. Things like this division bar going all the way under both of those numbers, because both of those numbers were over there when I went to divide by 5. Things like that are super important. So I want you to understand that this is my answer, and it matches my other answer because I'm just showing you another way to do it. But saying f negative 1 of x equals x plus 5 and then just a sideways slash 2, that is not the same thing. If this was in parentheses, then maybe that would be okay. But I suggest you start using horizontal division symbols so that you clearly can tell what's on the division bar and what's not. Okay, number 2, I'll keep doing these 2 ways for a little while. So number 2, if I was going to write down the math that was happening here, when you plug in x, you would subtract 3. Then you would square root it. Then you would add 7. So if I'm going to do backwards and opposite, so up the list and opposite of add is subtract 7. Then I would opposite of square root is square. And opposite of subtract 3 is add 3. So I would put an X on the paper. And I'm going to do the things in red in the order they're written because I already went backwards. Subtract 7, everything squared, so parentheses, and then add 3. My equation was g, so this is g inverse. And then notice on this one, I didn't talk about it before because it didn't happen, but on this one we have a square in our exponent. Anytime we have a square in the exponent, we need to restrict the domain. That was a little dark. Restrict the domain if necessary. So this is going to make a parabola, right? It's going to make a parabola with a vertex at 7, 3, and it's opening up. But if I draw the inverse of that is not a function. So I need to get rid of half of my parabola so that it is a function. So we need to restrict the domain at the x value of the vertex. So we're going to put a comma. X is greater or equal to, and then the x value of that vertex is 7, right? We spent a lot of time on parent graphs, remembering where the x value was, opposite the parentheses. This whole thing including the restriction, is the answer. One more time showing you switching. Switch x and y. X equals root y minus 3 plus 7. Start solving for y. Subtract the 7. You'll notice I'm doing everything I did in red because that's how we find the inverse. I'm undoing everything. Last step, add the 3. On the last step, I write it in my fancy notation. And because it's squared, I restrict the domain at 7. We are just going to agree that we will always do greater or equal to. Technically, I could do less than, but if we all just stick with greater than or equal to, we'll all get it right. Okay, number 3. Why don't you try number 3? Pick a method that you like. It's totally up to you. I'm going to do number 3 just one way. I'm just going to do the listing out the steps way. I'll do number 4 the other way so you see both. Pause the video and see if you can do number 3. Okay, so far I've written the order of operations, right? If you plugged in a number, the first thing you would do with minus 4, then you'd cube that answer, then you'd multiply by 2, and then you'd add 5. So if I'm going to write it down backwards and opposite, I'm going to subtract 5. I'm going to divide by 2. The opposite of cube is a cube root. And then add 4. So now I have my list of the steps I'm going to do. I'm going to do them in the order it's written. I'm going to start with h inverse of x equals, leave some space, put an x on your paper, then subtract 5, divide all of that by 2, cube root over everything that's there, and then add 4 at the end. Make sure it is not in that cube root because 4 happened last. This is my answer. None of my exponents are squared, so there's no restriction. Again, I'm going to do number 4 by swapping x and y. You can do it any way you'd like. Pause the video and see what you get on number 4. Okay, so I already switched the x and y, and now I'm going to start getting y alone. So the plus 2 is the furthest away from y, so that's the first thing I'm going to move. Then the divide by 7, the opposite of that would be to multiply by 7 on both sides. Because the x minus 2 is already there, it needs to go in parentheses. The y plus 3 is stuck in a square, so the opposite of that is to square root both sides. That's not very neat. And then plus 3. So then I need to minus the 3 to get y alone. I'm going to write it over here, starting with my fancy notation. Don't forget the notation. I have square root of 7 times x minus 2, and you're welcome to distribute that 7, but why, right? And then I'm going to minus 3, but the root was already there, so your minus 3 needs to be outside of the root. Then look at the question. The question had a squared on it. Whenever you see a square in the question or the answer, you need to restrict the domain. So x greater or equal to, that's what we're always going to do. The question is where the squared is, so that's where you do opposite. So opposite of plus 3 is minus 3, and this whole thing with the notation and the restriction is my answer. So hopefully that helps you guys with finding the inverse. Okay, so then moving on to inverse graphs. Sketch a graph of the function and its inverse. So you know your parent graphs, so we'll sketch x cubed plus 1, so it has a locator point at 0, 1. It's a cubic with an a value of 1. Try to make it look like half a parabola going that way, half a parabola going that way. To find the inverse, if you graph the line y equals x, so a straight line through 0, 0, with a slope of 1. Try to draw a straight line. And you imagine folding your paper on that straight line. Then what will happen is your x and y values will switch. So if f of x had the point -1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, then f inverse